This is the Depth Mystic Community Podcast, Episode 9, The Scalding Hot Cauldron. So we're just thinking about episode 9. I have a ministry now. I first discovered Joseph Campbell when I was 19 years old. And very quickly, the Kundalini, great serpent of the universe, energy, took a hold of me. And then 6 months after that discovery, after having died, or at least gone through what's called an ego death, I found myself in an extreme state where the world dissolved completely. And I was in a gray void. Then a circle appeared in that gray void, and I passed through it. I curled up into the fetal position, and the moment I passed through it, I was bathed in a white light. And the way I tell the story, this white light held its grip on me for the next 21 years. Now, I don't know anyone else who has a story like that. But then again, it only amounts to something if I can express it somehow. If I can make a podcast, for example, that reflects the energy that took a hold of me. While I was having my mystical experience, the white light was so hot that I had no way of even beginning. Just like Paul of Tarsus was blind for 3 days and couldn't do a darn thing until luck would have it, he got some help. He couldn't do anything. And I was like that for 21 years. So I couldn't really begin my ministry, even theoretically, until after that. And finally, on October 1st, 2018, the contents of my mystical experience were put into a container. Because there's so many things that I could talk about, I typically find that I can't select beforehand what my episode is going to end up being about. It's kind of like a pot of boiling water, where you can't just touch the water directly. You kind of have to get a ladle, pour it into a bowl, and wait a little bit before you can drink it. That's what trying to figure out how to present the contents of my mystical experience feels like. So each episode is just taking the next ladleful of boiling hot soup and pouring it into a small container and waiting for it to cool. I mean, it took 7 years, even after the cauldron was created, before I could get this ministry rolling. That's a scalding hot cauldron. So let me provide for you a few drops from the scalding hot cauldron. And remember, I can only take one ladleful in any given attempt. Let's try to give just a little taste of why the contents of the mystic vision are too hot to handle. One of my primary missions, as it turned out, was to know deeply the psychology of Carl Jung. To give some kind of context for why Carl Jung is so important, maybe the major question we have to ask is whether or not religion is evolving, or if it's set in stone. Because the Middle Ages kind of set in stone the 3 major monotheistic religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And those are like the 3 contenders, the 3 big monotheisms. And sometimes they feel like a prison When you see some of the stuff coming out of India and Japan and even the ancient cultures, you see so much stuff that's missing from the monotheistic worldview. And there are even things in the monotheistic worldview that they themselves believe are missing. In Christianity, the big one would be the second coming and the end times. Christianity believes in the end times. But the question is, when's it going to happen? And that's kind of what Carl Jung's extended work in the realm of myth and religion and philosophy is largely addressing. One of the major problems dealing with the end times is that in traditional medieval religion, the whole thing's a little bit overwhelming. All of the indicators of how it comes to an end are pretty violent and apocalyptic, and honestly not very helpful. Because the problem with monotheism is that it's too intense already and too violent already. So becoming more intense and more violent is not the answer. Carl Jung's book Aion is, in a way, a description of how we might be able to just manage the end of the world. And that's where astrology comes in. Now, for the record, I don't really believe in astrology. I have never had any experiences that have convinced me that the motions of the planets and the stars and the sun and the moon are tied to my own personal experience. I literally don't believe in astrology. But the problem is that the religions that created the Western world are trapped in an apocalyptic mindset. When we think of the end times, we think of the destruction of everything, basically. And that's because it's traditional in the medieval religions to think that way. Astrology is the only existing tradition that provides some other way to explain how we can steer this boat in a more reasonable way. It looks at the Christian era, by which we still measure our years, as one phase in a larger astrological process, which is known as the precession of the equinoxes. And the thing about the precession of the equinoxes, it's not that we're happy about having to use astrology as the way to get outside of our current situation. I, for one, am not happy about having to use astrology as the only way to give us some perspective. But that is the general point of Carl Jung's essay in his book Aion, is that, for better or worse, astrology does provide a kind of context that we can use to get a sense of where Christianity came from, what it is, and where it's going. The zodiac's divided into 12 constellations. And there is a very slow process wherein the seasons transition from constellation to constellation very gradually. And for whatever reason, we've been in what's called the Age of Pisces, which is thought to coincide with Christianity. And we're going to move into a new constellation. See, in Christianity, only 144,000 male virgins in white robes survive the apocalypse. So there's nowhere to go with that, if that needs even saying. There's nowhere to go with that. We need a new way of looking at what's going on. And Carl Jung's suggestion is that we look at the last 2,000 years as the age of the constellation Pisces, the fishes, and the precession of the equinoxes goes backwards, which means we're headed into the Age of Aquarius. This gives us a possibility for actually living life and not being so obsessed with the end times. So, if the choice is between the total destruction of everything, 144,000 male virgins who survived the apocalypse, and the astrological new age of Aquarius, it's going to be a lot easier to go with Aquarius. If you're asking me what happened with me and my mystical vision, this is my best explanation. Or at least it's the best context that I can come up with for what's going on. If we see my mystical vision as a continuation of the Christian drama that started 2,000 years ago, maybe you'll understand why the Cauldron is so scalding hot, why it's so difficult for me to talk about this stuff, and why I have to take it so seriously. What we can see is that the Holy Spirit is now transforming in order to bring about the post-Christian Aion. The Age of Aquarius has to be issued in by people who are aware of the psychological phenomenology involved. And so I've been appointed, as it were, to immerse myself in that phenomenology and to basically have a sense of what it is. And it's largely a study of the human psyche, as Carl Jung points out, the realm of psychology. But it's not entirely just psychology. It's also the historical activities of various sociological and physical forces. In many ways, the Age of Aquarius, it's just a return to the version of reality and society that isn't so affected by post-traumatic stress disorder. Because arguably, Western civilization is a kind of traumatic stress. One of our goals is simply to get over that stress. It's to identify the source of it and to heal from it. So that's going to do it for episode 9. In order for anybody who wants to comment on this podcast to have a place to do so, I set up both a Facebook group and a Discord server. And I will link to them in the description.